Some stories in the Bible are so big and so well known that they seem to rise off the page. And they cast a shadow over the stories before and after them to the point that we can forget the context in which we find them. Take, for example, John 3:16, the most well-known and well-loved verse in Scripture. But what does John 3:15 say? Most people probably couldn't tell you right off the bat. Or Matthew 7 verse 1, judge not lest ye be judged. But most have no idea what is going on in the rest of that chapter. Luke 15, the prodigal son, the most well-known, the most well-loved parable that Jesus ever told. And yet it is followed by perhaps the least known and perhaps even least understood parable, the parable of the Shrewd Manager. And that is our study for this evening. The parable itself is laid out like this, with verses 1 through 8, the first half of verse 8, giving us the parable, and the second half of verse 8 through verse 13, giving us some teachings from Jesus that are obviously meant to be understood in light of the parable we just heard. So what we want to do tonight is hear the parable, talk about some of the difficulties that we might find within it, and then discuss the points that Jesus seems to be making with it. So the parable itself. A rich man learns that his manager is being wasteful with his money. And notice the word here for squander or wasting is the very same word used to describe the prodigal son in the previous parable. So the rich man calls in the manager, admonishes him, and says that because of his dishonesty, he is being let go. The manager quickly gets a dose of reality as he realizes, number one, he cannot do manual labor and he will not go and beg. And so he comes up with a plan, a shrewd plan, as Jesus will soon describe it. He lowers all of the debts of the rich master's clients. 100 measures of oil becomes 50. 100 bushels of wheat becomes 80. And when the rich man learns of this, he commends the manager for his shrewdness. And that's it. That's the end of the parable. It ends very abruptly, and then Jesus moves right into giving us some teachings that, again, seem to flow out of that parable. We'll get to those in a moment. First, let's make some observations about this parable. Parables, as we may have seen over the last few months studying these on Wednesday nights, parables can be slippery things. Some of them seem easy to grasp, and that's on purpose. Take, for example, the parable of the sower. We read it and we feel pretty good about determining what Jesus is talking about. And then when Jesus actually goes on to explain what it means, most of us find out we had a pretty good grasp on it. We, like his audience, can grasp it easily, and so we can internalize it. We can take it with us. We can remember it. We can not only remember it to apply it to ourselves, but we can tell it to someone else and live it out in that context. That's one of the great things about parables. They are stories that are easy to remember, take with us, and tell somebody else. Other parables seem easy on the surface, but have even deeper meanings the more that we study them. Again, we think about the parable of the prodigal son. While the parable certainly portrays God, who represented by the Father, as loving and welcoming and forgiving to his children, even when we come back in the midst of failure. And of course, we see ourselves as the returning son, and all of those things are good. They are helping answer the question, what is God like? The real thrust and spotlight is on the older brother, who represents the audience that Jesus is telling the parable to. And it represents their inability as the Jewish leaders to be loving and compassionate to those that were the other, the outsider, the sinner. And so they are contrasted with the loving father, while they represent the obstinate elder brother. And then there are parables like this one in the opening of Luke 16, the Shrewd Manager. We're not really sure at first glance what to do with it. It doesn't seem to fit any of the other templates on the parables that we've used before. It's not allegorical, where each character represents something else, like the sower. And it's certainly not a moral lesson, though we might be quick to think that it is. However, remember, it is called the dishonest manager. Other versions may call him the unrighteous or the unjust manager. The opening verse says he is squandering his master's possessions. And lest we go to look for a moral lesson later in the parable, remember that even later on, the master commends him not for being righteous or upright, but he commends him simply for being shrewd. Shrewd is not a word that many of us use very often anymore. It comes from the Greek phronimos, and it's most often translated wise in a very practical sense. It means practically prudent or sensible. And so in other words, the manager is commended because his methods are practically wise. They're good for him, not that they are necessarily morally upright. The manager is commended for his shrewdness, not his goodness. So if this parable is not really an allegory, and if it's not an example of moral behavior that we ought to mimic, well, what is Jesus driving at? A few things can help us along the way. First of all, let's think about the context of this parable. The parable in Luke 16 comes in the midst of a larger section of Luke 14 through 17. This is a section of parables and teachings that Jesus gives while he is on his way to Jerusalem. In chapter 15, we have three well-known parables: the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And all of these are given to a mixed crowd of Pharisees and tax collectors and sinners, and as we will see, Jesus' own followers and disciples. The parables here are meant to comfort the sinners and challenge the Pharisees, all in the hearing of each other. They are also focused on a singular question: what is God like? What is the character of God? The widow, the shepherd, and the father in these parables all show great concern for those things that have gone missing: the coin, the sheep, and the son. And they show the compassion and love of God toward those who seem on the outside and are longing to come back. How desperate he is to have them back, to welcome them back, searching and seeking after them, even at expense and danger to himself, and rejoicing when they return. And so as we go into chapter 16, there's not any kind of narrative break. It reads simply as a continuation of teachings in the same general time and place. The only real break is due to the chapter and subject headings that later authors added in. So the same mixed crowd of Pharisees and disciples is listening to the parable of the shrewd manager just after hearing the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And so the mindset is still the same. What is God like? It continues here. And so we can assume that in some way this parable is speaking to that issue of God's character. But what we're going to see is it's really speaking to something even more prudent to Jesus' audience. The other thing besides context that can help us make sure that we're trying to understand this parable the best way is making sure we understand what actually takes place in the parable. Of course, we are dealing with first century situations that would not have all have been lost on his original audience, but may in many ways go over our heads today. So first, the manager reduces some very big debts in order to gain favor with the clients of his rich master. Now, in today's measurements, he reduced a debt of approximately 875 gallons of oil to half that, around 440 gallons. He reduces a debt of approximately 1,000 bushels of wheat down to 800 bushels of wheat. And in total, these reductions amount to approximately 500 denarii, or 20 months of average wages. And if that's all, and that's if all your wages for that month went to that debt. And so in total, he may have removed anywhere from 10 years or more in wages off of those bills, the amount of time it would have taken to really pay those off. Secondly, why the commendation by the rich master? Well, the implication might be that by lowering the amount of the debt, there was an incentive to pay the debt off in full right then. What we might call today a no penalty early payoff. And so the master suddenly has a great influx of cash rather than having it span out over a long time. But more likely, it's just as it reads, the master is simply impressed with the manager's shrewd actions. He is impressed by the manager's ability to think quickly and look out for himself, to use money to help not only himself and not only the master's debtors, but even the master himself, to turn a difficult situation really into a win-win-win for all parties. The master makes his money up front, the clients have their debt reduced, and the manager ensures future employment by gaining favor with these clients. In a business sense, it is definitely a commendable set of actions. Again, from a sensible business perspective. All right, so hopefully we've ironed out some of the wrinkles in this parable. But we still might be asking ourselves, what is Jesus' point? What is Jesus using this parable for? And this is one of those times where Jesus does, in fact, do some explaining and some elaborating rather than simply ending the parable without any further explanation or interpretation. There are 6 verses, the second half of verse 8 through the end of verse 13, that follow the parable, and they're all pointing to one main idea that is really the thrust behind this parable. And Jesus goes right into it after finishing the parable. Look at verse 8, which will set up the whole application. Verse 8 reads like this. It ends the parable and then moves immediately into the application. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. In our desire to sometimes look for deeper hidden meanings, we sometimes miss the much more obvious meaning that is being given to us. Jesus is saying and giving us a comparison. He says, look at how shrewd the manager was. If the sons of this world, or the sons of this age, the non-believers, the pagans, are wise and sensible in their worldly dealings, shouldn't you, as sons of light, Christian believers, be even more wise and sensible in dealing with eternal matters? It is very much in light of the way Paul will say things later. If this, then how much more this? Jesus holds up the parable of the shrewd manager. He tells the whole story to serve as a comparison. He tells about a crafty, shrewd manager pulling the audience, as he always did, into his story. His audience listening nods their heads as they listen and they say, wow, that guy really was smart. And then Jesus drops the hammer. If there is this much shrewdness, this much sensible wisdom in using worldly wealth for temporary gain, how much more should you as believers use worldly wealth for eternal gain? In other words, look at the attention that we pay to worldly matters while we ignore eternal matters. And then all of the verses that follow verse 8 now are focused on elements of that one idea that Jesus has just set up. Use your wealth wisely in light of eternity. Start with the manager and see his wisdom and his shrewdness, and then realize how much more this matters in light of eternity. Let's start with verse 9. Make friends of yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Well, unrighteous wealth simply highlights the worldly nature of money. Many times, wealth is unrighteously gained and unrighteously used. And ultimately, Jesus says it will fail us. But his point is that while we must use it, while it is a necessary evil, a necessary part of living in this world, do so in a way that makes friends like the manager used it. Be generous and giving and compassionate. Be forgiving of debts. Use it in a way that draws people to you rather than driving them away. And in doing so, you reap eternal rewards. Because as Jesus is going to go on to explain, how we use and view wealth is a direct reflection of how we understand God, of our faith in God. Verses 10 through 12 may sound similar. We find them in other Gospels as well. The way we handle our money says a lot about our faith, our understanding of God, and our view of other people. Jesus says if we are faithful in little, we will be faithful in much, and vice versa. If we are dishonest with little, we will be dishonest with much. Again, talking about the way that we handle money. In the same way, if we do not handle our worldly wealth in a righteous way, how can we be expected to handle our heavenly wealth in a righteous way? In a very real sense, Jesus is showing us that this world is a testing ground of sorts, meant to help us better embody the traits of righteousness and goodness. This is a world of discipleship formation, and it's smoothing out our rough edges. This world is meant, with God's help, to make us better followers, better disciples of Jesus. And how we handle our money here is a huge indicator of our level of discipleship. It is a discipleship litmus test, we might say. And again, the implied comparison is back to the manager. If a worldly manager like this can be that smart with his money, where everybody wins, how much smarter should we be when we have the advantage of understanding money in light of eternity? And then we come to verse 13, which really ties a bow on all of this. In the end, Jesus says, we are really talking about the object of our worship. Is it God or is it money? It cannot be both. Yet if we are not careful, we will always drift toward one, which is usually money, and away from the other, which is usually God, to the point that we hate the one and love the other. Jesus says we must be wise and be intentional about our allegiance to God and let our handling of wealth flow from that faith in God. In other words, our worship of God should direct the way we view our money, rather than our worship of money dictating the way that we view God. And so we might leave it like this. If a dishonest manager can be that generous with his money to his own worldly temporary advantage, how much more should we as Christians be generous with our money to our heavenly eternal advantage? I hope that this study tonight has been a blessing to you. I hope that as we enter into this holiday season, that you are able to enjoy time with family, even at a distance. Know also that over the next 2 weeks, we will have devotional thoughts from some of our church elders that will be shared with you. And you will find those not only in an email link that will go out, but you can also find it here next week on our Facebook page. May God bless you this week.